Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's panel that's going to focus on common indicators and measurement gaps in measuring the impacts of business on well-being and sustainability. We've heard a lot about business this morning. We've heard about some of the challenges that we face in terms of trust, but we've also heard that business is truly committed to having a positive impact on well-being, whether it be related to the environment, to health, to education, and there is a lot of investment going into these important areas. The OECD is doing really important work in this area as well. There are 3 projects that I wanted to highlight. First is a stock take on the types of reporting initiatives that are being undertaken that was discussed at one of the morning panels. Today we'll have a discussion on papers and suggestions for measurement of well-being. And later today, we'll also have a discussion around the platform for business for inclusive growth. And as you know, private sector, this is the first time, as I understand, that we're included in this World Forum on Statistics. And I think it's great to be here because for us, we love to have the evidence. Evidence is everything and measurement is everything. Where we have measurement, we can take concrete action and we can work better together as one of the stakeholders, together with governments and together with the civil society. I wanted to just give a little bit of context because one of the issues that has also been featured at this World Forum is the digital transformation. And that gives us a lot of data. But the question, and we'll hear it from our speakers today, is data is good if we know what we're using it for and we know how to use it. And I think this will be one of the issues that is highlighted in the papers today. I also wanted to mention some of the issues that we see from a business perspective, because sometimes it can be challenging. When we talk about well-being, what does that mean in concrete terms? So we're looking at the objective of measurement. What are we reporting on, and what are the outcomes that we're aiming towards when we're looking at giving information or data? Is data and information representative? The business sector, and we'll hear this again in the papers being presented, is incredibly heterogeneous, and we have sectors, we have different issues, and we have different causes. We also need to understand bias and cultural differences from country to country, from society to society, looking at business and the role that we have in our countries and communities. And in this respect, we also need to make investment in the long-term trends. How can we get good data that's truly comparable and useful over time? And that brings me to my last 2 points to raise that we'll be hearing about, is the challenge of bringing together quantitative and subjective data, and also the issue of cost. Reporting requirements can be confusing, they can be burdensome, and good standards should also aim to be cost-effective. And this is not only for businesses that are doing the reporting, but for those actors such as governments or civil society that are on the receiving end of the data. We want to make sure that it's clear, it's well understood, and has value. And finally, I would like to say that for us, as the business community, the OECD is the right place to have this discussion because companies, first and foremost, need a good business environment to perform well and to contribute to well-being. So we need the policies in place that can make that happen. So bringing together the statistical research, the evidence base, and the policy discussion is, for us, the great value of the OECD and the great value of being here today. So I would like to now turn to our panel and our very distinguished speakers today who have contributed papers to this measurement initiative and have been selected by the OECD. First, we have Diane Strauss, who is Research Director at Yale University for the Initiative on Sustainable Finance. Next, we have Mr. Hugh Julia, who's a Senior Researcher at the Economic Analysis Division of Statistics Canada. We have Dorota Vezyak-Bialowska, who's working with the Sustainability and Health Initiative for Net Positive Enterprise at the Harvard School of Public Health. Then we have Ms. Anat Itesarig, who is the Chief Scientist and co-founder of the company Be Better, which is a data analysis company focused on helping public and business entities measure and improve well-being. And finally, we have Mr. Laszlo Andor, currently head of the economics department at Corvinus University and former EU Commissioner for Employment, Social Affairs, and Inclusion. So with that, Diane, I invite you to take the podium. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So my objective today is to give you a brief overview of the state of corporate reporting on the question of well-being. And this presentation summarizes the results of a paper presented to the OECD. It's a review of the corporate practices of 48 companies in the food and agricultural sectors across the world. And so I will start by describing briefly our methodologies, then I'll present some findings, and I will hopefully have enough time to discuss some of the discussion points. On our methodology, we reviewed the sustainability reports, annual reports, and websites of these 48 companies across the world. And we manually reported each reporting items in a large Excel spreadsheet. We allocated to each of these reporting items an SDG, a topic with, which corresponds to target of the SDGs, or if there was no target, a topic that we clustered together. We allocated to these reported items one stakeholders or one constituency of the companies. We have identified a number of these constituencies: consumers, employees, local communities, global communities, and shareholders, and suppliers. So for each of the reported items, we scored the quality of the reporting from 0 to 4. So let me illustrate this methodology with the SDG that you see on the screen. For SDG 6, which is water and sanitation, we organized 3 targets: access to clean or sufficient water, water quality management, and water resource management. Then for access to clean and sufficient water, we actually found that most of the reporting items were dedicated to local communities. 15 items was reported from 11 companies, and the average score is 2.7. So what does this score mean? A 2 is the average score. A 0 would be only communication mentioned in the sustainability reports. A 2 would be a backward-looking quantitative matrix, and a 4 would be a backward quantitative matrix, a forward-looking target, and a strategies on how the business is going to adapt its core strategy to tackle the issues. So what are the findings? The first finding is that, non-surprisingly, corporate reporting lacks consistency. So out of the 16 SDGs and the 55 topics that we listed, only 5 of the topics met the consistency criteria. The consistency criteria were that at least 50% of the companies report on this topic, and the average score is minimum 2.0. And all these 5 topics are the following: GHG emissions, energy management, waste, social audits and monitoring, and gender equality. That's not a lot of consistency. The second finding is that most of the information reported by companies are output data, which means that companies report on their efforts. They won't report on their impact, which is more outcome data. So the data focuses on efforts to mitigate externalities. For me to give you a couple of examples, companies will report on GHG emissions and not necessarily on their alignment with climate scenarios. They will calculate their waste reduction by year, but they won't disclose information on waste pollution. And they'll tell you about the number of audits they've performed versus the well-being indicators. This is a fact and this is not a criticism, because this is the information that the companies have at hand, right? It's their efforts. It's very difficult to get outcome data, especially for companies. But that's an interesting point for our discussion later. Our third findings are that there were gaps all across the different stakeholder groups on the different SDGs and the different dimensions of the quality of life. I cannot cover all the stakeholder groups today due to time constraint, but I will cover two stakeholder groups, the employees and the local communities. On the employees, this is an interesting working group because we're not too far from having a consistent set of metrics to report on the different dimensions of the SDGs and the 8 dimensions of the quality of life mentioned in the Stiglitz, Fitoussi, and Sen report. So the metrics are available across all these dimensions, but with various levels of uptakes. Here you have a table. I won't go into it very thoroughly, but on the third column you can see the metrics that are available and the SDGs to which they correspond or the quality of life dimensions. For example, on gender equality, companies will report often on the workforce breakdown by gender and management level. So there will be a pyramid depending on the management level with a repartition of the gender, and we'll be able to identify the ceiling glass of women unable to go into management positions. And there will be information on the pay gaps. On equal opportunities, the workforce breakdown by minorities and management will also be disclosed. Some of the metrics are widely available are also the turnover rates. For health, the injury rate or numbers of days lost. And for education, the hours of training. We also identified some gaps where companies could report because they have the information, but these metrics are not very widely disclosed. Information on material living standards, for example, information on entry-level income could be interesting to understand the living standards of the employees depending on the geographical area. A second interesting metrics could be the level of representation of unions of employees, and that would fall into voice and representation. And on health, we found no companies at all that reported on operational diseases, while this is actually a matrix that is requested by the Global Reporting Initiative. So all in all, on employees, we could get into a consistent set of output data, but the lack of consistency of reporting prevents us to get this information. On the local communities then, this is another interesting stakeholder group because this stakeholder group is really, really misrepresented in the disclosure. Most of the information we will get in the reports are philanthropic information, and there will be missing data across all the SDGs, or most of the SDGs, and across the 8 dimensions of the quality of life. That's understandable because the data on impact on local communities is very difficult to get for companies. This is not information that they have at hand, and therefore it's difficult for them to produce such an assessment. But on the output information that they have, the quality is also very low. If we look at the SDG 16, for example, peace, justice, and strong institution, we'll see that there is poor quality of reporting on questions of taxes and lobbying, which are information that companies have. The average score is below 2.0. Only 1 company of the sample reported that they would pay tax where the company operates and committed not to use tax havens. On lobbying expenses, 2 companies out of 48 reported their full lobbying spendings, and that was because it's a US legal obligation. It seems to me that the SDG 16 is an important channel for impact from companies to local communities, and there is definitely a room for improvement here. On local communities, there is also an important or interesting trend that I wanted to present you. It's the efforts of companies to report on more geographic data and their impact on geographically based data. This is a map of the World Resources Institute displaying the water risk around the world. A few companies now report the number of sites where they operate, which are placed in the areas at risk of water scarcity. So that gives you an example of how companies can disclose their likelihood contribution to environmental risks. Few points of discussions before I close. First, an important fact is what framework should companies use when we're talking about well-being. I must admit that I actually struggled with the SDGs to find relevant gaps because the SDGs do not focus always on the same target audience. Some of them focus on local communities, some of them focuses on business, some of them focuses on cities. And it seems to me that actually a rigorous approach was easier and more easily reachable if we would take stakeholder groups one by one and study the various dimensions of the quality of life of the Stiglitz, Fitoussi, and Sen report. Take, for example, the local community, and you can then display the different indicators of the 8 dimensions of the quality of life, such as material living standards, health, education, personal activities, political voice and governance, social connections, environment and insecurity. The SDGs are still a very helpful tool when we talk about the products and services of the companies. And I think probably we should have 2 frameworks here. A framework to focus on the corporate operations and sourcing, using the well-being dimensions of quality of life, and a framework for products and services using SDGs. That's for discussion, and I'm happy to discuss with you later on that. Another discussion point I wanted to raise is the fact that companies disclose more output information versus outcome information. Again, as mentioned earlier, this is information that they have at hand, and this is normal that they produce more output information. But I see 2 ways forward to help companies disclose better information on their impact or outcome data. One of them is subjective questionnaires, and I'm sure we will cover the subject today in the panel. And one is the production of independent environmental and social data, such as the aqueduct report I presented to you today, that will help companies measure the possible impact that they have on the ground. Thank you very much.
Diane, thank you. One question. You had mentioned about some of the gaps in measurement. And do we have the right tools? Are there tools that you could foresee that could be created? And also, what is the role of the OECD? You had also referred to the well-being framework in your presentation.
I think that tools are being developed, but they're not available yet. And I think the findings of my studies is really that the well-being framework around quality of life mapped against the different stakeholders could be an interesting tool for companies to report on their impact. And I think the OECD, because it carries this framework and because it has so much influence, could actually help bringing together the reporting frameworks such as the GRI or the SASB, sorry for the jargon, and discuss with them how to harmonize the disclosure frameworks around this question of well-being.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Hugh Julia from the Canadian government. Hugh Julia.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank OECD, the Statistics Korea, and then the City of Incheon for organizing such a wonderful event. Really be honored for me to be here. So the talk I'm going to give today is about the job satisfaction and the workplace policy from Canada. So this work is joined with Danny Liang, also from Statistics Canada. Now, ever since the Stiglitz report in 2009, There's a widespread acknowledgement that material well-being, such as income, wealth, GDP, is far short of the measuring overall well-being or happiness. Since then, the few broad measures of well-being have been developed, such as the Better Life Index from OECD, Sustainable Development Goal from United Nations, and also Human Development Index. So let's look at the, let's take example of the Better Life Index from the OECD. So it's including 11 areas. And the question you want to ask is, what the impact the business can have on this 11 area? And the answer is maybe many. But one of the most immediate impact the business could have is on their own employee. So this talk, I'm going to focus on the job satisfaction of the employee. So job satisfaction formed an integral part of the subjective well-being, right? We spend like 1/3 of our time every day on the job. So how happy you feel on the job is really important for the overall well-being. And as Hammermash put in, the job satisfaction is a single metric utility or welfare the work can derive from their job out of the entire profile of the job and the workplace characteristics. So why does it matter for business? Because job satisfaction is important for business. There's many studies that show that higher job satisfaction will lead to lower quits and absenteeism, lead to the higher job performance and productivity, and higher organizational performance. So it's business' own interest to improve job satisfaction for their employee. So the question we'll try to ask in this talk is, what business can do to improve job satisfaction? To answer this question, we're using a unique Canadian longitudinal employer-employee match survey to evaluate the relationship between many workplace policy and work job satisfaction. So what we find is, yes, it does matter. So what we find is, first of all, is employee participation program, especially the communication mechanism between the employee and the management is really important. And also the personal and the family support program is also important for improving job satisfaction. So the data we use is from Canadian Workplace and Employee Survey. It's running from 1999 to 2006. So you might be wondering, what's it going to do about this 10 years old data? Well, future lies in the past. It's just really nice data, as you will see later on, but unfortunately it has been discontinued. So this data is including a national representative sample of all business operating in Canada with paid employee. And for each select workplace, a random sample of up to 24 employees is also selected. It can tracking the business as well as employee over time, although for employees only tracking for 2 years. It has a very high response rate, right, ranging from 74 to 95%. Every year you get roughly 6,000 to 7,000 workplace sample and 17,000 to 24,000 for employee. The sample size is quite large. So in the survey, there's 2 questions regarding the job satisfaction. One is on the money. So considering the duty and the responsibility of this job, how satisfied are you with the pay and the benefit you receive? The second question is regarding the overall job satisfaction. Considering all aspects of this job, how satisfied are you with your job? The response is ranging from very satisfied to very dissatisfied. And this also covered many work program policy. The workplace we're going to focus on in this talk is including the following. Employee participation program is asking whether the employee participate in employee feedback or suggestion program, task team or labor management committee, and so on. And also asking for training and development, whether the employee receiving any job-related classroom training or on-the-job training sponsored by the employer, or whether the employer offer childcare, employee assistance, elder care, and fitness recreation service for employee and family support program. And then there's also a question asking about the non-wage benefit. Is your employer provide pension plan, life insurance, dental plan, or other health plan? So this chart I try to show you is the distribution of the overall satisfaction with job and money. There's a couple of points I want to make out. The first, in the middle, you can see the percentage of the worker that's satisfied with their job and money are quite similar, 56% and 57%. But on the right, in terms of very satisfied, it's 19% satisfied with their money, but 34% satisfied with the job. So there's more people satisfied with their job compared to their money. And also, if you look at the dissatisfied item, so 20% not satisfied with their money, but only 8% not satisfied with their job. So the message I wanted to point out that money is not everything. This table shows you the correlation between the job satisfaction and the workplace policy. The first one, you look at the correlation between job satisfaction and satisfaction with the money is 0.52, which is not 1. Right? So money isn't everything. We have something else to think about. Also, the second point I wanted to make is that all the workplace policy has a positive correlation with job satisfaction and significant at 1% level. So for the methodology, I think I'm going to skip this for save some time. So what we get from this talk, so this table shows you the result of the relationship between workplace policy and job satisfaction after controlling individual and workplace characteristics. So as you can see, on-the-job training, employee participation program, and personal and family support all has positive correlation with the level of job satisfaction and also the change in job satisfaction. On the other side, a union, which is based on whether the employee is covered by the collective bargaining mechanism, all has negative correlation. So the question is, how big this impact? So this chart shows you the impact of change policy on the change in job satisfaction. They look at the panel structure, the data. So the blue bar show you the impact changing policy from no to yes, which means from having no such policy to have this policy in next second year. The impact of that on the changing the probability of the improving job satisfaction. So, for example, having employee participation program, that's increasing the probability of improving job satisfaction by 0.02 percentage point. So, but how big? The question is how big is big, right? And then we look at the similar impact from if you increasing wage. So the yellow line measure the similar impact from changing the hourly wage from 3% to 40%. That's lead increase in the probability only by 0.011 percentage point. So you can see all the program we showed here, employee participation program, support program, a much higher impact than you just derive from the increase in the wage. So let me conclude the talk. So we provide Canadian evidence on the relationship between job satisfaction and the workplace policy. We show that introducing the employee participation program, especially keeping the information flow between the management and employees, is quite important. And also we show introducing the personal and the family support program is also important. And the second point is that this impact sometimes can be large, which providing a cost-effective way for business to improve the workers' well-being. So money is not everything. This is especially important for small medium enterprise, as they are more likely to be financial constrained. So they have to look at beyond wage, beyond income on the table to improve the workers' well-being. The other thing I want to highlight is this work demonstrates and highlight the importance of and the usefulness of the matched employer-employee survey data in the study of the well-being. The evidence I show here is only for Canada. So whether this evidence is generalized to other countries, I hope the OECD can leverage international comparison, cross-country study, to look into this. And also, I understand that it's sometimes expensive and impossible to have the match at the business level. But if we could it's also very useful if we could have the match at very detailed geography level, so we can using the geography variation of the business policy and also the individual well-being to study the impact. All right, that's for my talk. Thank you very much.
Excuse me. Thank you. Thank you, Hugh, for that presentation. I think it's a great example of what is really needed to make the business case for action that impacts well-being. And I appreciate that you made the comment about OECD, that this could be a great example for comparable research. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say further on that particular point.
As I said, it's really important to look beyond just one country, right? To do a cross-country study to gather as much as possible evidence on the impact of business, so we can show that it's really matter for business to care about their worker, and it's really evidence support that the relationship not just coming through the what they do for their worker, but also how their worker feel about their job, how happy about their jobs can also improve their own business performance.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that goes to your point about the importance of communication in these issues. Yeah. Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce and bring Dorota to the platform. And her paper is looking at a new approach to the well-being of factory workers in global supply chains, looking at examples in Mexico, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and China. Thank you, Dorota.
Thank you. Let me start with thanking for inviting me here. It's a great honor and pleasure. Today I'm going to talk about approach to measure well-being of factory workers in global supply chains, and I will use as an example apparel factories in the 4 countries. And this is the study in which we are supported by Levi Strauss Foundation. Let me start with telling you what the well-being is in this study. I recognize the term is complex, but please bear in mind that this is research, but very applied research, which means that we need to care about how we communicate, because we communicate a lot with factories. So for us, well-being in this study is a state of positive mood when employees are happy, healthy, and engaged. 3 important pieces. And when we talk to managers, factory managers, we underline that there are multiple elements in the model of well-being and business. We start by arguing that obviously working conditions, physical and psychosocial working conditions, influence not only work performance, but also human flourishing or human well-being. But it's not obvious for everyone. There is also a reciprocal relationship between human flourishing and work performance. We also stress that we need to look beyond workplaces. That's why we examine family life and in its impact on work performance, and also conditions of communities. So basically, in this project, we focus on individual well-being, organizational well-being, which is about caring culture, caring climate, dignity, respect, trust, and also community well-being. So these 4 elements, workers, factories, families, and communities, are sources for drivers of well-being. And that's how we designed a questionnaire we use. In this questionnaire, we have a set of questions about working conditions, but also about human flourishing. This is our metrics for well-being, and it comprises 12 questions grouped in 6 domains: life satisfaction and happiness, eudaimonia, from Professor Sachs' speech today, meaning in life, social relations, physical and mental health, character, and virtue, again the link to this speech of this morning, and also financial stability. We collect also information from the survey about performance outcomes, self-reported, someone may say subjective, but still informative, about job satisfaction, work engagement, etc. Along with this, we request factories to share with us their own data, so-called hard data or objective data, from their payroll system, from about efficiency measures, to make a business case for them. We use this data to link them to the survey data, and we try to show them the implications of caring about workers' well-being on performance of the company. So we have measures, instruments to collect quantitative information, but also we collect qualitative information, which are complementary. So we conduct 1, 3, and 6-month follow-up interviews, we organize focus groups with workers, and we collect spontaneous information, spontaneous comments in the suggestion boxes. And so far, we've surveyed more than 9,000 workers in 4 countries, in 9 factories. In Mexico, we've been twice. In a couple of months, we are coming back to China, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka. And also, we are going to Poland, the only developed country, which will give us additional insight into the problem we are dealing with. So the theoretical background for this job originates from theoretical models: job demand control model, effort reward imbalance model, job demands resources model. But what is more important, I believe, is our practical approach. The aim of this project is to publish papers, obviously, but also to understand the relationship between worker well-being and business performance, and to develop partnership for learning and optimization of worker well-being. That's why so important for us is to avoid patronizing and to encourage engagement. That's why so important is the way we communicate the results. We need to avoid statistical jargon and carefully choose the evidence we want to share with factories. So let me present you some selected results, leaving behind all statistical details. So what you can see right now is a series of graphs. Actually, 5 of them. We need to look at them vertically. In the first column, you see a set of different psychosocial working conditions. And in the first row, you see 5 selected work performance outcomes. The first 4 are from the survey. The last one, turnover, so information about quitting factory, is from the hard factory data. And how to read this graph? So whenever you see the bar, it means that association we examined was found significant. The longer the bar, the stronger the association, and green bars mean positive association, yellow bars mean negative association. I'm talking about associations because to calculate this, to have these results, we used cross-sectional data. And I believe it's really important to distinguish between correlations, associations, and relationships or causal impact. So let's look at 2 selected factors. We see that social support from coworkers. So reports about I can depend on my coworkers for help are associated with 3 out of 5 presented here outcomes. They likely negatively contribute, they increase likely stress or social support, decrease stress, increase job satisfaction, and limits the risk of quitting. While workplace verbal abuse, we see 4 significant associations with depression, with stress, work injury, and job satisfaction. As I said, we look beyond workplaces. That's why I'm presenting here some results about associations between home life and human flourishing. And the same rule about reading this graph. So let's look at 3 selected factors. We see that for work-family conflict, there is a negative association with 4 flourishing outcomes. Easy access to healthy food at home is positively associated with human flourishing. Verbal abuse in families, again, negative association with human flourishing. This problem of aggression, both at workplaces and at home, it's quite prevalent. This is what we learned. We see here the prevalence of workplace emotional aggression in the 4 countries we visited, in selected factories there, and the prevalence of sexual harassment at work. It's also gloomy when we look at domestic partner violence. Again, emotional aggression, physical aggression, sexual coercion, they are there. Please bear in mind that probably these statistics are underreported. These questions are quite sensitive. Not everyone is ready to disclose, and not everyone is aware of experiencing this abuse. But what I wanted to show is that both types of aggression may influence work performance. And right now, I consciously use the word influence, because right now you see the results based on longitudinal sample. So we are more able to talk about causal implications here. And when you look at workplace aggression, we see that it increases number of limited ability days. It increases the risk of intention to leave. It decreases quality of work and job satisfaction. Similarly, for domestic partner violence, though a little less significant relationships, but still what is going on in families impacts work performance. It so should be treated as importance for business. Quite interesting thing we see here, the column for turnover is empty, although workplace aggression was found to be in relationship with intention to leave. And intention to leave is perceived as a good proxy for turnover. What we found is, yes, that's usually true, but maybe not necessarily for developing countries. Actually, turnover models were developed for corporate world, for developed countries. Maybe we should look and revisit them when we talk about the developing countries. So what are the challenges and gaps we identified? First of all, we argue that it's of real importance to use longitudinal data when we talk about impact, when we talk about causality. We know it's challenging to get them, also in developing countries because of high turnover rates, for example, because of confidentiality issues. When we do study in factories, when the production is organized in lines, it's not so easy just to sample randomly workers and pick them and ask them to take the survey, because it means a disruption of production. Second point, do survey data provide sufficient evidence? Yes, they are, I would say, but the message is better understood, is more convincing when we link survey, subjective data, with objective factory data, like in turnover analysis, or if we want to estimate what is the cost of productivity loss due to distraction and maybe absenteeism and how job satisfaction contributes. Third issue is about cross-cultural comparability of well-being flourishing questions. When we ask about purpose in life, when we ask about importance of social relationships, it's really subjective how these questions are perceived. We know that in collectivist and individualistic cultures, the perception is different. Next point is about applicability of turnover models. I've already said that maybe we need to revise them if they work for developing countries. And finally, engagement with vendors. This is crucial if, I would say, if we want to see changes on the ground. We found that vendors, factories differ in terms of their attitude. But we also learned that sometimes there are quick fixes to improve the situation. So for example, we have an example of a vendor who increased quickly number of funds and drinking water fountains after learning about the dehydration problem. They even invested and provided free transportation. They even bought a face recognition payment system, something obvious for us in developed countries, after they learned that there were some problems with number of worked hours, miscalculated overtime hours, basically problems with the salaries. So the final message I would like to send here is that for us it's important to be partners, not to patronize and convince vendors to be engaged. And last but not least, this is the team of fantastic females working in this project. Eileen McNeely, Tamar Cousset, Carlouette Leon, without whom it wouldn't be possible to get these results. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dorota. One question I had in your paper, you had talked about the idea of moving away from compliance audits to minimum standards and trying to move towards excellence. And I wondered if you could comment on that statement in your paper, because this is about going above and beyond what is required. And I think that your study is showing how you can have impact with partnership and with the engagement that you've had in the supply chain.
Great question, thank you. Thank you so much. So what we've learned is following. There is compliance, but it's quite often made on the basis of ticking the boxes. While we try to convince vendors that going beyond, that caring about life satisfaction, about social relationships, not only living standards is also important. And I would say that Levi Strauss Foundation, who supports us, is getting to understand this. So yes, compliance, it's something what is necessary, but I think we should try to go beyond. And I think it's possible, though it's challenging. I'm not naive. In supply chains, there is a lot about purchasing practices, but I still believe it's possible. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So next, I'd like to invite Anat to the platform. And Anat, you're our one company representative on the panel with your company Be Better. And I think you'll give us some more explanation about how we can make the business case for well-being and business action.
I will try.
Thank you.
So good morning. I'm really happy to be here, and especially delighted as I feel that my journey aligns really well with the OECD journey on this topic, on well-being. I attended the 2007 World Forum while I was writing my PhD, so belonging to academia, and then years after, continued to follow up with the conferences as a public sector member, applying the knowledge of well-being to the public sector. And starting, say, 3 years ago, I belong to the private sector as I co-founded a company dedicated to improving well-being and measuring and using good measures of well-being. So I'm especially happy to be here. And thank you for all these really, really interesting presentations. I'll try to follow the obligation of the last speakers in a panel to keep it very short and as interesting as possible. So, by now I think we know that everyone should be measuring well-being. This is not just a public sector obligation, it is also something that the private sector should get involved in. It's all about bridging the gaps, using the science of well-being to measure well-being in a holistic manner, so to speak. So what type, again, we are the only corporate on this panel, so I'll try to share our experience. So we have clients from the public sector. I'll just name municipalities looking to examine the well-being of their citizens, of their residents, because of course they are in so many manners responsible for that well-being. And within the private sector, we've heard in these excellent presentations the duty and responsibility that private sector feels towards their employees, first and foremost, but also in terms of corporate responsibility. I think the main point here is that everybody is starting to see the value of aspiring for well-being. Why? Because it contributes to success. If you're aspiring for well-being, your success will increase. And while your success is increasing, you can make sure that well-being is improving. And so it's a win-win cycle. In our paper that I encourage you to look at, we looked within the construction industry to a case study examining the key performance indicators of the most leading companies within the construction industry and comparing them with SDGs, with how they report for SDGs, and with the framework of well-being. And what I find most interesting is that while KPIs, the key performance indicators, and corporate responsibility indicators they're easy for corporates in a way because mainly they are objective. So you count what you can count. Now, I'll take it back. It's not easy, but it is a routine that is more familiar to the corporates. What is less familiar to the corporates is the well-being aspects. So it starts with taking note of the different life domains that they impact, like safety, infrastructure, health, as an example. It also speaks to the fact that we are familiar with the different elements that impact our lives to the greatest extent, such as trust. We know we can measure trust. Yeah? The question is, do large corporates take that into account when they measure? And in our analysis, we have seen that it is still yet to be reached. And happiness elements. We know what happiness is composed of. It's composed of general satisfaction, hedonic experience, and the sense of purpose that we attribute to things in our lives. So the knowledge is there. The question is, how do we bring everything together? So to us, the missing piece is quantitative subjective indicators. If I know how people are feeling within the supply chain, as workers, and also in communities where the corporate has large effect, I have the complete picture because I have the objective indicators in many of the cases. What I don't have is how people take that experience. Why is that important? Why is that a gap? It's not just a gap of measuring. It's also a gap in well-being. Consider CCTV cameras. I can measure number of CCTV cameras to check whether a certain neighborhood is safe, but wouldn't a much better measure be, do I feel safe to walk alone after dark? So much simpler and so much more indicative of the situation that I wanted to look into. So to us, it is a gap that definitely can be bridged, but why should they? What's in it for the corporates? So again, speaking from what we see in our day-to-day work and the research that we conducted, I could speak of the fact that they want to know better, but I want to focus on retention. I want to focus on the fact that replacing employees is very, very costly. And so their number one incentive as we meet it is we would like to make sure that we maintain our employees and we improve how they work rather than having to let them go and recruit new ones. What's in it in terms of the corporate sustainability? So that's, to me, even more interesting. In some industries, if you want to be eligible to win a public tender, you need to be able to report on different SDGs, different elements of your impact, mainly on the environment. And I will use this stage later to encourage the World Bank and other organizations to make sure they incorporate subjective indicators, quantitative, again, very easy to measure, to make sure that we know not only our impact on environment, but also on people. So the good news are that we have what it takes. We have very, very good public sector knowledge on what well-being is, what is the framework. The OECD has done fabulous work on guidelines on measuring subjective well-being and the Better Life Index, of course. So we're so familiar with the domains and with the different elements. It is right there. The other part of that map is the private sector. Private sector has lots of solutions that we could combine with that well-being knowledge. So it's fast, it's digital, it looks for quick solutions, and it has the resources to do these things. So bringing the two together is especially interesting. How do we do that? Again, we need to meet the needs of the corporates. So we start with the client drivers. What is it that they're looking to What is it that they're looking to do? What is it that they're looking to improve? So say they'd like to increase engagement. Say they would like to, I don't know, I mean, you just name to increase productivity. We take that. On top of that, we put the well-being science. What is it that we need to know in order to help them do that? Incorporating the two, using a fast, effective tool of surveying, digital surveying, fast and easy, and it gives results not only on the corporate level, not only aggregated results from, say, the employees or the communities they affect, but also on the personal level, on the individual level. Because I think people are tired of giving away data. They want to get something back, and we can give them something back. We've got very good on our digital tools. We create a logic in which if you indicate certain elements, you get your own personal feedback telling you something about your well-being. So it's a win-win situation in which the individual and the organization gets the statistics, so to speak, not in a statistical manner, but in a way that is easy to communicate. And all of that leads to better policies and better strategies. And what you're seeing here is basically a roadmap of what is it that we can do with that science. You're seeing an example from a village in Ghana, and if you look at the lower right-hand side area of this table, you're basically seeing a meeting point where high importance and low satisfaction and experience meet. So I mentioned the three components of happiness earlier: the general satisfaction, hedonic experience, and sense of purpose. We align the three, so you see there's a point for general satisfaction and there's a point for, a dot for experience in each and every life domain. So this right lower hand side basically is a red zone. It is very important to the people of the village, and they're very unsatisfied with it. An additional element is that we have benchmarks. We have the measurements from around the world. Sometimes they are more granular and more with a higher resolution. Sometimes it is more general. Where can they aspire to? Where should they aspire to as they try to provide better policies? Another point is the fact that, yes, they need to remeasure, and this has come up in one of the presentations earlier. It's not a one-time thing. You don't get good strategies and good understandings if you only measure once. So this is an example of the second measurement, and what you're seeing, and this is of course a simplified version of that, is the change at the midst of the project that they were experiencing, an infrastructure project, and at the end of that project. And so you can see how the trend had moved on certain elements. So what are the challenges? First and foremost, you have to have commitment to the process. When we meet with the CEO saying, well, I'd like to try this once, and you can tell that they're thinking, we'll show off the results because we did this very cool thing of measuring well-being, that's not going to work. Definitely not going to provide a good roadmap for the future. It is going to work in the sense that it is a good pulse check of what's the situation like, but it is not an ongoing commitment. But say they have the ongoing commitment, and also say they have a passion to know better and not to, hide from what the truth is and what their employees or communities are actually thinking. The two really big challenges, as we see them, is first, what are they responsible for? And we get responses such as, am I responsible for the well-being of my employees? Am I responsible for their health? And it is a question, and what can I do if it's bad? Because it's not under my responsibility. So that's a question that comes up quite often. There are answers to it, but I'll leave it to the discussion. And last but not least, what do we do if we're obligated as the corporate, yeah? What if the corporate or the public sector entity are obligated to share their results? And what if they're not flattering? And that is a thing that is alarming to most companies. Again, it takes commitment, it takes the desire to know better, and there are ways to deal with it, but these are real challenges that we're facing. To sum everything up, I think the most important message, as far as I'm concerned, is A, people matter. It is important how they feel, not just what we count around them. B, it is possible to measure their well-being in a fast, effective way. It doesn't have to be tedious. And maybe most importantly, it allows better strategies to increase success, better strategies to increase well-being. And so to us, well-being is the future. Are you ready for it? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. And just briefly, I wanted to ask you a question. You talked about the client drivers. We raised the issue of small and medium-sized enterprises at the beginning of discussion that may have limited resources, but it's just as important for them to have this consciousness about well-being. I wondered if you have any experience in your company with the SMEs.
Thank you. It is indeed challenging. What we normally advise is to take it step by step, starting with, you don't have to measure the entire chart, or even every life domain, say 9 or 11, the number really doesn't, it's not that crucial. But we advise, if you start by monitoring subjective elements and taking them into account, and it could be 1 indicator, 2 indicators, 3 indicators, and if you know that you do most of your work within, or you have large influence on your employees, say in the area of safety, and you only measure their subjective perspectives in the domain of safety, already they've taken a huge step forward without it taking a huge toll on their budget and on any other element of the conduct of the company.
Okay, thank you. With that, Laszlo, I turn the discussion over to you and questions for our speakers.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, I should congratulate the presenters. I think we have heard very interesting presentations. In my intervention as a discussant, I would like to focus on 5 key issues, starting with economics, then data, then institutions, number 4 would be paradigm, and number 5, tools. Regarding economics, I think in the last few weeks, most of us participated in discussions about the 10 years of the financial and economic crisis. Why am I saying this? Because what we work on here is an evolution and perhaps also a revolution of the business models. And this is, in a way, a key conclusion out of the analysis of this crisis period, that most of our countries, definitely I can say it from a European perspective, we do need new business models, and we can only arrive to new business models if there is a dialogue between the policymakers, the analysts, and business itself. And there are some obvious aspects of this new business model, what concerns, for example, financial sector regulation. On the other hand, there are some other aspects which might be a bit more hidden, not so obvious for some, but we believe that these are very, very important, like the question of human resources. Are we going to waste human capital, as we have been doing in the past period before the crisis, with a lot of non-inclusive, non-sustainable models that Europe unfortunately shared with many other parts of the world. I would give for the discussion a kind of hypothesis about how economics has turned around regarding the question of resources since the Industrial Revolution. Because in the late 19th centuries, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, there was an assumption that labor would be finite, but on the other hand, natural resources would be unlimited. And that's how economics contextualized the possibilities of economic development from the perspective of the resources. And today, there are probably many who believe that the opposite is true. Now there is a lot of awareness about the limitations of natural resources, but after population quadrupled in the last century, and we are approaching 8 billion on Earth, there might be this belief that labor or human resource is infinite, and that's what we can factor into our considerations regarding business. Now, there couldn't be bigger fallacy than this one, and I think the focus on well-being is exactly based on the need to confront this fallacy, that we can be just very ignorant about the human and social implications of business practice. And the assumption we share here is that the availability of data and the capacity to analyze data in a much more effective way than in the past allows us to improve the business model and the practice of economics. Now, this is, I think, largely true. We have seen a kind of harvest of the new approaches and the new type of analysis of workplace practices, especially what concerns measuring well-being. Probably the last 10 years brought about a little explosion of methodologies of how to measure well-being and how to improve it, and how to reconcile the concerns about employee well-being with the objectives of business. This also requires a much greater amount of data which needs to be collected from the workplace and sometimes directly from the employees. Then the questions come. Whether everybody is really happy with the collection of this huge amount of data. You know, you arrive to the workplace and you press the button if you are happy today. You tick the box from 1 to 9 whether you think your employer is really paying attention to gender balance, or you feel really safe in the environment. And you never know when this type of data will come back in a different form and affect your position at the company or at the workplace. So there is a lot of fear, which also has been expressed, especially from the representatives of labor recently, that all this data collection would lead to some kind of surveillance capitalism, which only adds to various other forms of dystopia, which emerged with digitalization and robotization, that all these new technologies will eventually only lead to more flexibility, not for the sake of human resources, but actually at the detriment of working condition, enhancing job security, enhancing job insecurity, and leading de facto to the end of job security and the end of the welfare state. So the question is not simply to have and present micro-analysis about well-being. I think the question and the challenge also is to prove that all this will be built on what has already been achieved and further improve the conditions from economic and social perspective as well. What kind of data is supposed to be collected? I strongly believe in evidence-based policy, and I think that requires outcome data, but we should also notice that what is an outcome data for the employees might not be the same for the company as a whole, and that needs to be reconciled somehow, which leads to the centrality of connecting data about well-being with data about productivity. Whether there is evidence that in the long run, improving workplace conditions, improving well-being practices actually leads to greater productivity. I think business is easier to convince about the better practices if there is this evidence, although I think we should also be able to argue for investment into better working conditions if the outcome is productivity neutral, right? That it's not costing at the end, but with the same business outcome, there is a possibility to improve well-being. And then, of course, it could be incentivized, but I come back to this at the end. We heard that in order to have reliable and evidence-based approaches, there is a need for collecting data in the longer term, because that will be statistically more powerful. On the other hand, I think in many cases we simply cannot wait until all the long-term, decade-long or generation-long data is being collected. So we should be able to argue for better practices if someone is supposed to be sound and not yet proven to be sound. Now, the third point I promised is institutions. And let's just strike into the middle of that. Is the OECD the right forum to discuss all this, what the OECD can do? I think the last 10 years proved that the OECD has been very powerful in, with an initiative to go beyond the GDP, and this current discourse could create something similar to go beyond profits and wages. Of course, profits remain very central for business, and wages remain very central for the workers, as we also heard. Nevertheless, for both sides, the world is a lot more complex than these financial indicators, and the OECD, together with other institutions, together with other fora, can indeed promote a new approach. Which fora and which institutions exactly? I would look back to cooperations of the recent period. For example, the multilateral world. And of course, we would have a difficulty to identify where exactly in the multilateral world are the best partners. What comes up as a natural candidate is the International Labour Organization, ILO, which is there to promote tripartism, social dialogue internationally, and also help to develop tripartism to a new level and integrating it into the operations of the G20 as well, which should be also a forum to discuss better practices with well-being. But the social dialogue, I believe, is very important also for the analysis. It's not only a forum for wage negotiations. If you want to carry out an analysis which is going to be sound and powerful, there has to be an agreement between the employers and employees, first of all, what matters. And then secondly, if you collect a lot of subjective data, you only can expect that the subjective data reflect the reality and the real feelings and opinions if there is trust inside the organization. And the trust is always stronger where there is already an institutionalized and well-established social dialogue. Of course, I also have to highlight the possibility of the European Union and the European institutions in general. Number one, because we have a remarkable agency focusing on working and living conditions, the Eurofound in Dublin, and I think there is a lot of methodological cooperation and interaction between Eurofound and the OECD as well. But on the basis of the Eurofound studies, and what the European Commission itself was digesting in the last crisis period, we saw that satisfaction with the workplace and the working conditions is also strongly affected by the macroeconomic developments. Right? So it matters a lot when exactly you carry out a survey. If you do it at the time of a crisis, your outcomes will be worse. So the business cycle itself will affect your micro level findings, and that also explains why the European Union is always emerging from this analysis as a very polarized system. That countries where the macro finances and the welfare states are stronger, they will also display better outcomes with satisfaction with the working condition and vice versa. Europe is interesting because there is indeed an obligation to collect data in an even fashion across all the member states. So it's really a warehouse for analysis and at least the effort to make evidence-based policies also in this area. But it also is a territory where, due to the imbalances, there is a big question of how the uneven development, for example, of industrial relations and working conditions contributes to labor flows. And whether the labor flows actually help to rebalance the uneven development or contribute to those and aggravate the problem. I think because of these imbalances, we can indeed invite business into an exercise to spread the better practices. Business should be a partner in sharing the better practices in the area of well-being. Otherwise, in various parts of this integrated big market, which is the European Union, the degradation of condition leads to very serious bottlenecks, which is going to be a problem for the long-term growth potential. Now, the fourth point I wanted to hit is the question of the paradigm. I think there has been a shift from the dominant paradigm of the 1990s, which was corporate social responsibility, towards well-being. And there are lots of lessons to be learned. The question is what you can achieve with reporting requirements, which of course are possible if you have sound analytical tools, but reporting doesn't necessarily make you popular, especially with the smaller and medium-sized enterprises. So when, for example, the European Union was promoting gender balance also through legislative tools and reporting requirements about the representation of gender in corporate boards, SMEs had to be exempted, right? So the capacity and the representativity of various types of business matter a lot, and if you don't get the right focus, there can be what we call emotional aggression and verbal abuse against the institutions, which inappropriately set the policies and inappropriately choose the tools. But comparing well-being with the CSR experience, I would again like to warn against a kind of simplification that the CSR would be only about the impact of business on the outside world, society and the environment, while well-being only has an inside focus. I think we heard from the papers that there is a very important communication between the two. You can't have this artificial separation. For example, if well-being improves inside the company, there will be a greater attraction towards potential employees, potential workers, members of the community towards that enterprise. So because of communication, demonstration effects, labor turnover, you cannot assume that there would be a kind of iron curtain between the two sides. Also, if the outside world is more stable and people can rely on an effective welfare state, stronger municipalities, stronger communities, it will have a positive feedback also on the workplace well-being. So I think these connections indeed are very important in the analysis, but also the policy making. That brings me to my final point, which is about the tools. And we also heard a few comments about the possible tools, mainly focusing on tools that can feed on the analysis and produce reports and the sharing of the better practices with those who are lagging behind. Now, there are, of course, more effective tools as well, like legislation. And on many of the issues which are in the focus of the analysis, like the psychosocial conditions, there is a constant debate about leaving such issues to the so-called soft tools, or actually going into legislation. And that's that is a question also for the European institutions, which are supposed to be in the vanguard of improving workplace safety and health and working conditions in general. But sometimes legislation is a bridge too far, and you have to work in a more complex way. There is always a demand when there is an evidence about specific conditions and negative outcomes, that something should be ruled out. But the more heterogeneous your community is, the more difficult the legislation becomes, and you fall back to procedures which are considered to be more complex, but very often they are the only way. There is, on the other hand, another tool, which is financial incentive. And many governments and the European Union itself do have financial capacities, financial tools, in order to generate a trend towards improving practices. For example, if you want to improve work-life balance, and I think we agree on the centrality of the work-life balance regarding well-being of the employees, there can be even more. financial incentives in this area. But in order to make those effective, indeed, they need to be built on sound analysis, and that's also why the contributions we heard today are so important. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Laszlo, for pulling out those points. And I think you raised some interesting questions beyond the presentation of the papers. One of them was the point on social dialogue, a point that was not raised directly in our discussion. And social dialogue is it's a very, very important institutional approach to especially employment issues, social policy issues, but we also see that institutions such as collective bargaining frameworks are on the decline and now represent only 18% or 17%, I believe, coverage in the OECD area. And I wanted to relate this to technology and new forms of work and emerging business models. And perhaps as a closing question, we could get your reaction to this phenomenon of changing types of work. And how do you look at that in terms of well-being? I think another point that you raised, Laszlo, which is very, very important, is the concept of ensuring that our social benefit systems are aligning with these new forms of work. Well-being is very much, if we talk about job satisfaction, it's looking at this whole host of issues that may be covered by social coverage as well. So my last question to you all, and feel free if there are any other comments that you want to raise, is what is your outlook for the digital transformation on well-being and the issues that you raised in your particular presentations? Thank you. Diane, do you want to start?
That's a very good point, a very good question. My feeling is that the world and work is about to transform to new form, and we've seen that with more workers working from home. And these evolutions can have effects on well-being that are unprecedented and unknown. For example, in France, we know that a law has been passed to protect workers from constant connections to their workplaces because now they work from home. Mm-hmm. So to me, to come back to your question on digitalization, I think going back to also to the subjective questionnaires, digitalization is a wonderful tool through smartphones and apps to actually inquire about the well-being of workers and communities in general. And there are new tools such as natural language processing that help to process open qualitative questions to trigger, to harvest the comments of the people that are being questioned and get the trends and get their feelings, get their emotions around certain topics. So to answer the transformation of the job market, I see digitalization probably as a way forward, especially in combining the use of subjective questionnaires with natural language processing.
Thank you. And
that's a really good question. I think we need more evidence on that. My data is too old to answer that question. But personal experience that, as StatsCan, we're also embracing for changing, for modernization, and not only in terms of methodology, but also in terms of the workplace. So we're going to wireless, Wi-Fi. Employee can work anywhere within the organization and also at home, so we can have more work and life balance. I think it's important is the communication, as I showed in the talk as well. The communication between the management and the employee, and to discuss the option, the probability, the possibility, the impact of each one of the option could have on their life and then their work. That's really important to resolve any conflict between the employee and the management, and also their well-being.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dorota?
Yeah, very good question. So what we've learned from our study is that workers are really afraid of automation, of digitalization. It raises huge job insecurity. And I think yesterday quite right points were raised. Yes, digitalization is good, but for those who are skilled, who knows how to use them, on the other hand, those who are not trained enough, they can become excluded. And you know, there are pros and cons as always, and we need to be really careful when we are talking about digitalization. Thank you.
Anna?
I'll connect to that point by saying, yes, digitalization is alarming for many people and for many jobs, but it is also a very good tool to get current, momentarily data on how they experience this transformation. So what we do in Africa, for example, is bring iPads and collect results. And so you have up-to-date results, and the results, again, using digital means, are available on a dashboard that we constantly evolve. It constantly evolves, but there's a dashboard to show the results. And why is that important? 3 words: early warning signs. And anyone within the public sector and the private sector, what they seek the most are early warning signs, knowing which areas in the factory or which areas within the communities are going in a not the best direction and not the direction that they intended for it to go. And the sooner they find out about it, not when someone's knocking at their door, you know, turning tables, saying the situation is terrible, but prior to that, when people actually can have the means to indicate and say, this is not going very well for me. So that's really, really valuable. And again, it varies between, let's measure the pulse of well-being of the people and extract the type of insights that we can from that, to project evaluation, in which you evaluate a specific project. You have the budget for it because you launched the project, but you add to it the measures to make sure that you're going in the right direction. So it is, the digitalization is sometimes both the problem, but also the solution. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Laszlo, I'll leave you with the last comment. I appreciated that you talked about data and well-being, data and productivity. I think in this very uncertain digital transformation environment, that some of these fast-moving technologies are in fact going to provide us with more certainty. But maybe we're having a few growing pains at the moment. So your last comment, Laszlo.
Yes, the gig economy brings about risk, but I think that can be managed. There have been many examples. For example, when a country legislated that those working in the gig economy also have to receive at least the minimum wage. Or there have been legislative dilemmas whether you leave them as entrepreneurs or you declare that they are also employees, and the rights of the employees which have been established in the country also have to apply. Some of these big companies in relation to the digital revolution have been exemplary in terms of creating a better wage flow. And using the enhanced productivity not to distribute profits as quick as possible, but actually to reinvest the profits and also to use it to benefit the lower earners inside the companies. So we still need to monitor whether some good solutions also come out of that.
Thank you. Well, it's very certain that the OECD is the place for this discussion, where we're looking at the policy framework, we're looking at our experience over the past 10 years, as you've read in following the economic and financial crisis, that we need these dialogues to be connected. So we need a policy discussion, we need the evidence base, and then we need this micro-level data that you all are gathering in your specific projects and in your engagement to establish what is the business case for well-being. So thank you all for your presentations and for your excellent submissions to the OECD, and we look forward to continued work. And thank you.